Our first reading this morning comes to us from Adam's slate. It's called Prayer for This Day. Spirit of life, spirit of love, spirit of hope, spirit of justice. God known by many different names, you have given us a day unique from any other. You have connected us, all of us, with each other and with the world in ways that are largely a mystery to us. You have given us little instruction other than to be present in our own lives, to feel wonder at the creations of the universe, and to love one another. You have put gifts and challenges in our paths, joys and sorrows, strengths and frailties, some of which we have already encountered, and others we have yet to discover. On this unique day, may we receive exactly what it is that we need. May it be so. Amen. It was an ordinary, regular, rainy day here in upstate New York. Coffee in one hand and UU history course assignment page in the other. I was settling in for what I thought would just be another afternoon of homework. Yet, as soon as I opened the assigned reading for the day, Reverend Dr. Mark Morrison Reed's book, Darkening the Doorways, it quickly became apparent this was not going to be an ordinary day. I was settling in for an afternoon of learning about the incredible history of African American Unitarian Universalists that too often goes under-discussed, under-celebrated, and frankly, just often unknown. Shortly after I settled into the section of the book on the Unitarians, did the word Rochester jump off the page. Now, after doing a double take to ensure that they were not talking about Rochester, Minnesota, Rochester, Indiana, Illinois, because this happens sometimes, my eyes opened wide and my heart skipped a beat as I learned he was indeed talking about Rochester, New York. And I was about to read about a fellow First Unitarian Church of Rochester member and UU ancestor I had never heard of before. Her name was Mrs. Hester C. Whitehurst Jeffrey. Poring over the pages of Dr. Morrison Reed's book, I quickly learned that Mrs. Jeffrey was a Black Unitarian who dedicated her life to the fight for Black liberation, most notably through Black suffrage. Alongside other Black Unitarians across the country, including Frances Ellen Watkins Harper and Fannie Barrier Williams, Jeffrey was a key figure in co-creating the National Association of Colored Women in 1896, an organization of localized Black women's clubs which worked to protect, materially support, mobilize, and educate Black Americans in the aftermath of slavery. A friend of fellow notable First Unitarian Church member Susan B. Anthony and noted contemporary of Rochester abolitionist Frederick Douglass, I became eager to learn everything I could about Mrs. Jeffrey. I proceeded to turn to the work of the handful of non-UU academics and experts on Mrs. Jeffrey's life in order to do so. Upon moving to Rochester with her husband, R. Jerome Jeffrey, in 1901, Miss Jeffrey quickly became a known name within local social movements. In the words of Rochester AME Church historian Robin Noel, the African American people in Rochester at the time were mostly menial workers. They were not as educated as Mrs. Jeffrey was, so she saw a need to lift her people up. Despite the significant social barriers common for Black women in justice work in those times, Mrs. Jeffrey managed to work extensively both in Black-led and white-led organizing spaces to much success. Mrs. Jeffrey was known as an esteemed activist, organizer, and steward of Black women's history and Black history in general, both within the Black community and as a part of broader social justice scenes all across the nation. Dr. Susan Goodyear, an academic known for her work studying Mrs. Jeffrey's life, noted that Mrs. Jeffrey's activist accomplishments beyond the co-creation of the National Association of Colored Women included, but were certainly not limited to, creating many Rochester-based club organizations focused on raising money and resources for housing and education of Black youth and women, particularly seeing education as a key tool to secure the safety and thriving of Black people. Mrs. Jeffrey founded the Susan B. Anthony Club, a hub of support and organizing for Black women suffragists in Rochester, who frankly were just not welcome in most white-led suffrage spaces. She acted as the president of the New York State Federation of Colored Women's Clubs. She founded the Rochester affiliate of the Women's Christian Temperance Union. She was also the only person of color to present at the 1905 New York State Women's Suffrage Association at Mrs. Susan B. Anthony's explicit invitation. Mrs. Jeffrey also played a vital role in the preservation of the legacies of both Frederick Douglass and Susan B. Anthony, raising funds for, and frankly, quite literally singing into existence, the raising of Rochester's Frederick Douglass statue after his death, and being the only non-clergy person invited to provide a eulogy at Susan B. Anthony's funeral, a Black woman invited to share the pulpit of white clergymen at that time was no small feat. Mrs. Jeffrey was also responsible for the installation of the very first public memorial to Susan B. Anthony, a stained glass window at Memorial AMZ Zion Church in Rochester, which is still there today. And Jeffrey did all of this in the face of the pervasive, terrorizing landscape of racism and white supremacy enraged by the relatively very, very recent abolition of slavery. So as I learned all of this incredible information, though my excitement persisted and my interest persisted, I became a little bit more disheartened. Because given all that Mrs. Jeffrey had accomplished, why hadn't I heard of her until now? Despite knowing so much about my other famous congregational suffrage ancestor, Susan B. Anthony, why didn't I know Mrs. Jeffrey until now? Susan has monuments and books galore and is inarguably an icon for American feminism. Sure, her activism moved mountains and was impossible to miss. Susan organized and led so much of the white movement for suffrage. She made critical waves as she chose to break the law to vote in the presidential election, got arrested, and ultimately refused to pay the fine. Susan's own words ultimately became the 19th Amendment when it granted white women the right to vote in 1920. But Mrs. Jeffrey's work was not exactly small in comparison. Mrs. Jeffrey moved many, many mountains in her own right that would ultimately make it possible for all women to have the right to vote decades later, while also taking on a more comprehensive approach to organizing that Black women had to take on in that time in order to ensure that their people would live to see the ballot. As I learned from suffrage scholar Shannon Risk, activism in that time would and could never be simply about the vote for Black women in the ways that it could be for white women. White women tended to focus on and could more safely afford to participate in more public, dramatic, and risky roles as a part of their political strategies. Black women couldn't do that. According to Black suffrage scholars Sadula and Baron Hill, the organizing cultures of white suffrage and Black suffrage operated quite differently. For Black women organizers, suffrage was just one piece of a much bigger puzzle toward Black liberation, spreading their strategic focus more comprehensively across building systems of care and political access, again, to ensure that their people could survive. Black women had been using the format of social clubs to have networks of care to attend to the holistic needs of Black people since the Civil War and since the time of slavery. Needs white women organizers would not and didn't think to prioritize. Well, some of them possibly did not think to prioritize them on purpose. Black organizers knew they had to create their own way to protect their people's unaddressed needs, which shaped how they approached everything political. As Sedula and Baron Hill put it, many Black women have been made to move along the margins of political life as a standard practice of resistance to the systemic alienation of the misogynist, heteronormative, white supremacist colonial gaze of national belonging. Mrs. Jeffrey took on all of this. She accomplished so much against so many odds, and yet remains largely unknown in the American political zeitgeist. Laid to rest in an unmarked grave in Massachusetts, with the only preserved words of her own being the ones that she spoke at Susan B. Anthony's funeral. Her only public monument, relatively unknown to the world, at the Memorial AME Zion Church here in Rochester. Though scholars like Dr. Goodyear are hopeful the tide is turning on American awareness on the plight of Black liberation organizers and becoming more aware of the erasure of Black liberation struggle through the ways we have documented and whitewashed history, we simply aren't there yet. I will remain forever thankful for that afternoon that I opened Dr. Mark Morrison Reed's book, Darkening the Doorways. Not just so that I could learn about my congregational ancestor out of my own interest, though it was very interesting, but because Mrs. Hester Jeffrey's incredible and important story needed to keep being told. I wanted to continue the faithful process of unlearning the whitewashed history and give roses for my liberation where they are due. As we close today, I will, of course, invite all of you to check out for yourself the work of Reverend Dr. Mark Morrison Reed and all scholars of Black Unitarian Universalist history. Not only is it so interesting and often unspoken of, commonly within American politics, it needs to be spoken of in order for it to continue to exist in remembrance and in order for us to continue to get free together. As the song that we will close our service today with goes, the work that we have built, oft with bleeding hands and tears, often in error, oft in anguish, will not perish within our years. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of love, or the energy of action. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again. Dear ones, we are the builders of the glorious city. We are the carriers of our history. We are the truth tellers. We are the unlearners. We are the lovers of the next way of being. May you go forth in peace, in love, and with the bold courage to tell the incredible stories of the ancestors of whom we do not speak, but of whom we must. May it be so. Amen, and blessed be.